Okay, and today we're going to go over Surah 58, which is entitled "The Pleading Woman." In my translation of the Quran, it's "The Pleading One." Like I said, I'm using the M.A. Shakir translation for those of you who were curious, and some of the wording is a bit different. So it's known as the pleading woman, but in this one, it's described as the pleading one. It revolves around a woman who is seeking redress from Muhammad because she was divorced by her husband. Hi, GW. And she was divorced under a process called Zihar, which was the pre Islamic form of divorce. Hi, Hafsa. Thank you. Uh, Merry Christmas. And this was this is a bone of contention because Muslims like to portray Islamic divorce as an an enlightened, progressive, sometimes even feminist. If you're going with a really, really deceitful person, they'll try to portray Islam as a feminist religion, which is the amount of cognitive dissonance uh, required for that is mind-boggling. But they'll try to portray divorce as Islamic divorce as enlightened because they'll compare it to pre-Islamic pagan divorce practices and claim that they formalized divorce proceedings. So it wasn't an arbitrary, whimsical. You just decide to divorce your wife by telling her to leave your house. There were actually institutionalized practices that Mohammed brought about. And I'm going to show you why that is completely misleading and furthermore irrelevant when you compare it to the teachings of divorce from the Bible, which had already existed for centuries, and that Muhammad, uh, by comparison, the the Islamic teachings of divorce are retrograde and just contemptible when you actually look at them. So it begins by saying, Allah indeed knows the plea of her who pleads with you about her husband and complains to Allah, and Allah knows the contentions of both of you. Surely Allah is hearing, seeing. So he's referring to the two parties to this dispute. As for those who put away their wives by likening their backs to the backs of their mothers, they are not they are not their mothers. Their mothers are no others than those who gave them birth. And most surely they utter a hateful word and a falsehood. And most surely Allah is pardoning, forgiving. So here he's referring to when he says likening their backs to their backs of their mothers. This is zihar. This is the pre-Islamic practice of divorce, or at least the one that was undergone by the woman in this narrative. And in 3, it says, "And as for those who put away their wives by likening their backs to their backs of their mothers, then would recall what they said. They should free a captive before they touch each other. To that you are admonished to conform, and Allah is aware of what you do." And this is also ironic when you consider the Islamic history of slavery and the fact that Muhammad is the only creator of a major religion or cult, a modern cult, that was also not only a slave owner, but he was a slave seller. He would buy and sell African slaves. So whenever you hear Muslims try to claim that Muhammad liberated people, you have to keep that in mind. His entire adult life, from the time he started to go to war with the Quraysh, his own tribe, and attack and raid caravans, it was all about attacking and then subsequently enslaving people. But whoever has not the means, let him fast for 2 months successively before they touch each other. Then, as for him who is not able, let him feed 60 needy ones. That is in order that you may have faith in Allah and His Apostle. And these are Allah's limits, and the unbelievers shall have a painful punishment. And this is also a reinforcement of uh, the Islamic soteriology, which is basically acquiring good deeds or trying to outweigh your bad deeds, your sins with good deeds. And you see this repeatedly referring to zakat or or uh, or bankrolling Mohammed's military ventures, which in contemporary practice would be sending money to jihadists, groups like ISIS or Boko Haram or Al Qaeda, and this is that would be the contemporary equivalent of that. But it's always about doing good works, and the good works according to Islam, according to the parameters established by Mohammed a millennium and a half ago. These are what you have to keep in mind if you're a Muslim. If you're doing something that's wrong, that's if you're committing a sin, then you have to somehow try to balance it out and hope in the end that your good deeds will outweigh your bad. It's kind of analogous to the Egyptian version of the afterlife, the ancient Egyptian version, where where your heart would be put on a scale and a feather on the other side of the scale, and if it was heavier than a feather, then you would be condemned. It's very similar in a lot of ways uh, to that, and it's not surprising when you think of Islam as a co-option of a pagan philosophy. He basically Muhammad took some of the core ideas from the pagan Arabs and adulterated them and changed them and grafted himself onto these beliefs. And so they're somewhat different, but they really aren't fundamentally that that distinct. So, uh, in the fifth verse, it says, "Surely those who act in opposition to Allah and His Apostle shall be laid down prostrate, as those before them were laid down prostrate. Indeed, we have revealed clear communications, and the unbelievers shall have an abasing chastisement. On the day when Allah will raise them up altogether, then inform them of what they did. Allah has recorded it while they have forgotten it, and Allah is a witness of all things." And this is something, if you go back to verse 5, this is something you'll find throughout the chapter, even though uh, even though the ostensible focus is on this woman's divorce and Allah's mercy through Muhammad, what you find where it says here, "You may have faith in Allah and His Apostle. Surely those who act in opposition to Allah and His Apostle shall be laid down prostrate, as those before them were laid down prostrate." And this is something you'll find throughout the chapter, and you can find it in some of the uh, latter verses. For example, in 13, where it says, "Do you fear that you will not be able to give in charity before your consultation? So when you do not do it and Allah has turned to you mercifully, then keep up prayer and pay the poor rate." Again, a very works based soteriology, and obey Allah and His Apostle, and Allah is aware of what you do. And you'll find this throughout the entire chapter. The idea of obeying the commands, not only of Allah, not only of the the being that's described as God and it is thought of as God for Muslims, but obeying Muhammad. So the two are inextricably linked. You can't disobey Muhammad without disobeying God and incurring his wrath and potentially endangering your own salvation. You can't really do anything to question or attack or gainsay Muhammad without endangering your own soul. Hi, Miss Bluebird, and MVD Love and Light. Who else? Uh, Diora, yeah. Um, so you can't do any of that without endangering your own soul, and this is why Muslims are so fearful, and it's why. To just give one recent example, the Pakistani professor. This was a Pakistani professor who had studied in the United States and come back to Pakistan to teach. He has just been given a death sentence for supposedly blaspheming Muhammad. Now, the media hasn't focused too much on this aspect of the story. They've described this case and how, in fact, his attorney, I think one of his attorneys was murdered for defending him, and the other was threatened with death. But one of the interesting aspects of this case is the way the blasphemy laws are employed in places like Pakistan and these Muslim nations. You never find someone being prosecuted, being given a capital sentence for blaspheming Allah. Excuse me. Or very rarely, there are instances of that happening, but you very seldom find a Muslim being prosecuted or a Muslim being threatened with death for blaspheming Allah, for saying Allah doesn't exist or questioning Allah. Almost all of these cases, and the vast majority of the honor killings, and there are over 1,000 honor killings in Pakistan, but most of these cases, they involve uh, criticizing or questioning or attacking supposedly Muhammad. And the reason is Muhammad is synonymous with Allah. Muslims try to deny this. They'll go to great lengths to deny the idea that they worship Muhammad, but you can't read the Quran without coming to that conclusion. It's inescapable. You just have to read the words of the Quran in order to come to that conclusion. For example, right here in verse 4, that is in order that you may have faith in Allah and his apostle, capitalized. So his apostle it's referring to Muhammad here. So you have to have faith in a man, not only a man, but a man who is just filled with sin and very as I described him in another video, who is basically degenerate. And a Muslim got really offended when I said that. One of the Muslims, I think it was Mohammed Qasim, or one of the other Muslims who watched the video, said that they were offended because like I called him a degenerate. But the truth is, there's no other way to describe him. This isn't some sort of subjective. This isn't like me and a Muslim disagreeing about whether Surah 3 enjoins Muslims today to go and forcibly convert people or to kill people. I mean, I would argue there's more evidence on the side of that verse not being abrogated, and that's why you see so much Muslim terrorism. But that's a theological dispute that's open to debate, but you can't really debate the facts. According to the historiography of Muhammad, written by Muslims, he was a terrible human being. You don't have to go to an anti-Islamic site or website or apologist to come to that conclusion. You just have to look at the records that Muhammad left. Why wasn't he? See that's the thing. You don't have any evidence that he was. All of the evidence by Muslim chroniclers describe him as just a terrible, degenerate, perverse human being. And there's nothing that you can. There's no counter. You would have to in order to counter that claim, you would have to deny the hadith and the tafsir and the Quran itself. It's a self-indicting argument. How so you're saying the Quran is fabricated and the hadith are fabricated? You're playing yourself right here. You're not you're basically saying is I agree, a lot of it is fabricated, but those are the only sources we have to go on. If you're going to assume that Muhammad was an actual historical figure, then you're going to have to rely on the Muslim sources. And the Muslim sources paint a picture of him being a degenerate. But I just wanted to go back to this, the idea of having faith in Allah and his apostle. Like I said, you only have to read the words of the Quran to come to the conclusion that Muslims worship Muhammad, and Muhammad intended them to worship him. That's why you're asked to have, or not asked, you're commanded to have faith in Muhammad and his apostle. You're told that you have to pay the poor rate and obey Allah and his apostle. So Allah and his apostle, these two are synonymous. Allah is Muhammad's alter ego. So you're supposed to worship Muhammad because he is the avatar, so to speak, of Allah in this world. And that's basically the Islamic belief system. They can deny this all they want, but all you have to do is actually read the words of the Quran. But to go back, to the specific focus, of this chapter, the idea that Muhammad changing zihar, the pre-Islamic divorce practice, that this was somehow an enlightened advancement, is not credible. Is not credible when you actually look at social relationships within the Islamic world and how divorce is practiced. Even the idea of a dowry, allowing a woman to keep part of the dowry, this was thought of as an advance or a progressive implementation, because prior to that they weren't allowed to keep. It wasn't a dowry so much as just it wasn't a dowry which they would have access to if the man decided to put his wife away or to divorce her. But the fact is that actually existed before Islam. That was and there are scholars you can read who will attest to this, that practice existed before Islam. So what are you left with? You're left with a religion that endorses divorce, even though divorce is something that's condemned repeatedly throughout the Bible, and you can go all the way back to the Old Testament. Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament. So you have in 16, "For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away, for one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit, that ye deal not treacherously." And this is understandable when you actually look at the model for marriage in Genesis. It's a man and a woman becoming one flesh. That was the standard, the motto prior to the fall of man. That was the motto for relationships, marital relationships. The idea of divorce and the idea of divorce was something that was not what God had in mind. And you can see this also throughout the New Testament, Jesus's teachings, when he tells people not to divorce, and that divorce and remarriage is the equivalent of adultery. So Jesus himself affirmed that the Islamic practice of repeatedly divorcing your wife, taking other marriage partners, plural marriage, polygamy, that's the equivalent of adultery. So Muhammad not only did he not improve the situation, he actually made it much worse. And you can see this. I talked about this in an earlier video when I was describing V.S. Nepal's travelogue. he went to 4 non-Arab Muslim nations, and one of them was Indonesia, and he was talking with a family who had they had become Christians, and one of the reasons was because the mother had been divorced by his wife by her husband after he took on new wives. He kicked her out of the house and basically impoverished that entire family. And this is a practice that was rampant throughout Indonesia and other Muslim countries as well. You have entire families that are impoverished, men that are growing up without fathers because of Islam. It's akin to what you see in some of the communities in Utah with the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. This um, this sect that strictly adheres to the teachings of of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith of taking on plural wives. They basically kick young boys out of the home before they reach during pubescence. Once they become adolescents, they kick them out of the home, and you have all of these fatherless children. This is basically the norm in Islam. If you want to follow the tenets of Islam and follow the tenets of Islamic marriage and Islamic divorce, this is what you have. Basically, the same thing as what you have with the fundamentalist Latter Day Saints in Utah, in certain towns in Utah. So the idea that this entire surah is premised on the notion that Muhammad was an enlightened lawgiver and that he somehow was was helping women, when the truth is Islamic teachings on divorce and marriage are the most anti woman and anti family policies that you could possibly adopt. And you see this throughout the world. In India, the idea of triple talaq, saying I'm going to I renounce you 3 times. This is a practice widely practiced in India's Islamic community, and this was the reason that when they tried to change this, when the Supreme Court of India refuted this, there were riots. There was an uprising within the Muslim community, and you had imams, Deobandi imams, and Islamic scholars rebelling against this. So this idea that divorce is something that Muhammad improved upon, that he somehow improved upon the practices of his pagan contemporaries, it's simply not accurate. So in verse 7 it says, he is with them wheresoever they are. Then he will inform them of what they did on the day of resurrection. Surely Allah is cognizant of all things. And I already explained to you how Allah is not omniscient. That's one of the reasons you know that Allah is not the true God, because he's not omniscient. Whereas the God of the Bible can foretell things hundreds of years into the future. He can describe what's going to happen many years into the future, even into the end of the world. Allah is severely circumscribed and limited, and that's because Allah is only infused with the features that Muhammad gave him. So it really is his alter ego. So anything that Muhammad knows, Allah knows, but anything that Muhammad is ignorant of, Allah is also ignorant of. And that's why you have such a limited God, a God that doesn't have the characteristics of the true God. Same way that Dagon or Baal or any of these other or Ashtaroth, any of these other false pagan gods, they basically have the same capacity as Allah, or Hubal, one of the idols that Muhammad removed. Allah is not any more knowledgeable than Hubal or any of the idols that Muhammad removed from the Kaaba. He's the same. He has the same amount of knowledge as Muhammad, which is severely limited, as I've already illustrated. So in 14 it says, "Have you not seen those who befriend people with whom Allah is wroth? They are neither of you nor of them, and they swear falsely while they know." And again, this is another ironic passage because Muhammad repeatedly makes false oaths, makes vain oaths, and swears falsely. And this is characteristic. You even see it at after various chapter headings in surahs. This would be it'll usually be the first thing he does is either swear to the Quran or swear to the moon or the stars. Again, also reflective of the pagan building blocks that Muhammad used to construct his religion. But you see this repeatedly, swearing false oaths. Allah has prepared for them a severe punishment. Surely what they do is evil. They make their oaths to serve as a cover, so they turn away from Allah's way. Therefore, they shall have an abasing chastisement. And again, this is ironic because Muhammad repeatedly makes oaths and swears oaths in order to uh, to deflect attention or deflect from a true indictment of his character or his actions. Neither their wealth nor their children shall avail them against Allah. They are the inmates of the fire, therein they shall abide. On the day that Allah will raise them up, then they will swear to him as they swear to you, and they think that they have something. Now surely they are the liars. The shaitan has gained mastery over them, so he has made them forget the remembrance of Allah. They are the shaitan's party. Now surely the shaitan's party are the losers. And again, this goes to the idea that Islam is something that has always existed among mankind, and that the Quraysh and the worshippers of various pagan deities are somehow forsaking a religion that existed that predated Muhammad. And again, I already pointed out to you how the Quran itself refutes this. It says Muhammad was the first to submit to Allah. If Muhammad was the first to submit to Allah, and this took place in the 6th century, then there couldn't have been Muslims prior to Muhammad. It's it's logically, I mean, Muslims don't understand this, but especially if they haven't actually read the Quran, but you can't have Islam Islam as a belief system prior to Muhammad if Muhammad says he was the first to if Muhammad says he was the first to submit to Allah, that means by definition he was the first Muslim. There were no Muslims prior to Muhammad. So to then go on and claim that Islam existed prior to Muhammad, not only that, but that Abraham was a Muslim who literally was a literal Muslim who literally worshipped Allah, or Jacob was a Muslim who literally worshipped Allah, it's simply impossible to reconcile those two assertions. So this is an example again of where the Quran is self-contradictory. It contradicts itself. It says Muhammad was the first Muslim, but no, Islam has always existed, and these pagan Arabs are defying Allah because they're corrupting something that was, and this is why you have Muhammad referring to the sacred mosque. He's talking about the sacred mosque. So keep in mind when he talks about the sacred mosque, this was when the mosque was in the Kaaba. It was controlled by pagans, so that there were only pagan gods there. So keep this in mind. There were only pagan gods, and it was controlled by pagans, but Muhammad is referring to it as sacred. Why is a pagan Why is a pagan structure sacred? It doesn't make any sense. And Muslims will say, well, that's because before the pagans came there, it was it was filled with it was worshipped by Muslims, and it was built by Abraham. But again, there's no evidence to demonstrate this. There's no evidence to demonstrate this, and the Quran itself refutes it. No, there's no. He didn't build it, but furthermore, the Quran itself refutes it. It says Muhammad was the first Muslim. If Muhammad was the first Muslim, then there could have been no Muslims prior to him, and this makes sense from a logical perspective because there's nothing in the Bible that gives credence to any of Muhammad's claims. Abraham was a Jew. He was the first. He was the first person to be the father of God's elect people. So Abraham and his sons were Jewish, and his grandsons were Jewish. They were not Muslim, and he didn't go anywhere near Mecca. Um, no, it equals the fact. No, the falsehood. It equals that Muhammad did not understand. He did not understand the Bible. He did not have. He did not have a grasp of history, and the falsehood is Muhammad trying to manipulate in a very, very ham-handed manner. No, it doesn't say in his era. It says he was the first to submit to Allah, period. In other words, the Quran says Muhammad was the first Muslim, but it also says that Abraham was a Muslim and that Jacob was a Muslim. Jake and Isaac was a Muslim. So again, it's self-contradictory. So it goes, 21 says, Allah has written down, I will most certainly prevail, I and my apostles, surely Allah is strong and mighty. And this goes again to the idea of Muhammad defensively invoking how strong and smart and brilliant Allah is, but he provides no evidence. When he describes miracles, he's describing miracles done by Yahweh, by the God of the Bible. So the parting of the Red Sea, or the birth of Isaac, all of these things, all of these miracles were undertaken by Yahweh. They had nothing to do with Allah. And the only quote unquote miracle that he cites is the fact that Muslims were victorious in some military battles. But again, uh, if you're going to claim that Muhammad is a prophet because Muslims won some military battles, then you're going to have to claim that Napoleon Bonaparte was a prophet, that Scipio Africanus was a prophet, that Belisarius, the general for the Emperor Justinian, was a prophet. In fact, they were much greater prophets because they conquered much more territory than Muhammad did. And in fact, Genghis Khan, according to that standard, then Genghis Khan would have been the greatest prophet because he had the longest contiguous empire of the ancient world, and even up to this point, it was one of the largest in terms of land area, the largest empire. So Genghis Khan was a much greater prophet than Muhammad, according to that standard. So in 22, it says, you shall not find a people who believe in Allah and the latter day befriending those who act in opposition to Allah and His apostle, even though they were their own fathers, or their sons, or their brothers, or their kinsfolk. These are they into whose hearts He has impressed faith, and whom He has strengthened with an inspiration from Him, and He will cause them to enter gardens beneath which rivers flow. Adding therein is well pleased with them, and they are well pleased with Him. These are Allah's party, and now surely the party of Allah are the successful ones. And again, just reinforcing this idea that Allah is the best. Allah, it's a God who has to repeatedly justify Himself with it, which is the antithesis of the God of the Bible. God God, in fact, God speaks repeatedly in the Bible and says that he doesn't feel the need to justify himself to to creation, to the people, creation, the created beings, the people should worship him because he is God. He doesn't need to repeatedly boast and try to stake a claim that he's God, because he is. He's not an imposter. He's not a false god or an idol trying to assert. He's not Lucifer. He's not the devil trying to reach up and 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 claim God's glory. He has God's glory because he's God. So um so this is something that you see repeatedly throughout the Quran. Allah trying to justify himself, and the reason is because he's not God. Um, it's something that's a recurring theme throughout the Quran, and something else here where it says those who act in opposition to Allah and His apostle, even though they were their own fathers or their sons, these are they whose hearts He has. This is something else. Islam creates division and hatred even within the family, and this is why you see so many honor killings. Like I said earlier, there are 1,000 honor killings in Pakistan. Muslims will not hesitate to murder their sister or their brother or their son or their daughter, their own offspring. They won't hesitate to murder them if they reject Islam, because that's what the Quran tells them to do. And they believe the Quran is a book that is eternal, even though that again contradicts Islamic theology and the concept of Tawheed, but that's what they believe. So anyone who questions the Quran or questions Muhammad, they're their enemy, even if they're their own flesh and blood. They're their enemy. They deserve to be killed because that's what Muhammad said. So this is why you see Muslims who won't hesitate to murder their wife or their husband or their son or their daughter, and you see thousands of women murdered in honor killings because that's what the Quran has prescribed. These people are enemies. And in fact, one of Muhammad's followers said, and David Wood has discussed this in his videos. He said, even if my own father, I forget if it was his father or his son, but basically, no, his brother, that's it. He said, even if my own brother, you know, um, if my own brother insulted Muhammad, I would murder him. And that impressed this person so much that he converted to Islam on the spot. That's that's the mentality of Islam, that you murder your own children and your own family in order to defend the honor of Muhammad, someone who had no honor in this life and can't really intercede or help you now because he's in hell. He's not he's not going to do anything. Like murdering someone, or committing the sin of murder, and and is not going to impress Muhammad. And even if it did, it wouldn't be important, like, because Muhammad had no relationship with God. So following his teachings is not something that's advisable in my opinion. And yeah, Hafsa mentioned Surah 4:434. So in Surah 4:34, it says, "Except those who repent before you have them in your power. So know that Allah is forgiving, merciful." And again, this is oh, I'm sorry, that's Surah 5. Sorry. Surah 4:43. Yes. O you who believe, do not go near prayer when they are intoxicated until you know well what they um uh, oh, okay. Here, I found it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My Quran is split into different. It's it it's kind of worn out by now, but um, yeah. So that verse describes how men are the maintainers of women, and the idea of men being the custodians of women. The way it's implemented in Islam is women have no legal rights. They don't have any sort of voice in the relationship, and they have no ability, even if their husband is endangering their life, they have no real recourse. And you see this in there are even videos that are on YouTube from Muslim imams who describe how wife beating is perfectly normal, and how Muhammad was right. And the idea is Muhammad did not have Muhammad's insights into human nature were very distorted because of his own life and what happened to him what happened to him as a young boy and growing up. And they were filtered through. I'm going to say this much: pagan Arab society compassionate um wasn't really compassionate, evolved society. So in that sense, um the Islamic criticism of that is accurate to a certain degree. But the problem is Muhammad took the worst aspects, or most of the worst aspects, of pagan Arab society and adopted them, and in some instances even made them more regressive. And this is something that you really need to read the Quran and look at history in order to grasp. One of the books that's really helpful in this regard is Ibn Warraq's "Why I'm Not a Muslim," and he actually describes the circumstances surrounding Muhammad's evolution into the leader of Islam, and his influences, be they pagan or Gnostic, and some other things. But Ibn Warraq's "Why I'm Not a Muslim" is a great book to look at the historiography of Islam and how it evolved. But I just wanted to do finish that surah 58, the pleading one. The next surah is surah 59, the banishment, and we have about 54 around 54 pages left. Of the Quran, of the read through, and I'm going to do that surah in a future video, and also do a video about Israelism, not not necessarily Black Hebrew Israelism, but the concept of Israelism theologically. I'm going to do that maybe later this week or next week. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming. Mohammed, the YouTube user, not the Muhammad of the Quran who's deceased, but everyone else, all of the moderators, and have a Merry Christmas. And if I don't see you before then, a Happy New Year. Anyway, bye.